A film that cost $250 million just made the entire world search for a poem written 3,000 years ago. Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey opened in July 2026 with Matt Damon, Tom Holland, and Anne Hathaway. And suddenly millions of people who had never thought about ancient Greece were Googling Homer, Troy, and the Trojan War. Which raises a question nobody in those film reviews is actually asking. Was any of it real? Not the monsters, not the gods, but the war, the city, the journey, the man. Is there actual archaeological evidence behind the greatest adventure story ever told? And what happens when you go looking for it? The answer, and this is the part that will genuinely surprise you, is yes. More than you think. And in ways that are stranger than the myth. Let us start where Nolan started, Troy. Homer's Odyssey is the sequel to his other great epic, the Iliad. The Iliad tells the story of the Trojan War, a 10-year siege of the city of Troy, by a Greek army, ending with the famous wooden horse. For centuries, most scholars assumed Troy was purely mythological. A great story, probably allegorical, certainly not a real place. The kind of thing intelligent people smiled politely at and moved on from. Then in 1870, a German businessman named Heinrich Schliemann did something that no serious academic had done before. He took the Iliad as a literal geographical guide and started digging at a hill in northwest Turkey called Hisarlik. And he found a city, then another city beneath it, then another beneath that, 9 distinct layers of human settlement, one stacked on top of the other, spanning thousands of years. The 7th layer, Troy VII, dates to approximately 1300 to 1200 BC, which aligns almost perfectly with the time frame scholars estimate for the Trojan War. And it shows evidence of violent destruction, burned buildings, unburied bodies, arrowheads and spear tips embedded in walls. Was this the Troy of Homer? Schliemann was convinced. The majority of modern archaeologists think the identification is at least plausible. None of this is settled science. But here is the thing. There really was a city at Hisarlik. It really was destroyed. And the timing really does match. So if the city was real, what about the war? Nolan's film depicts the Trojan War as a brutal, historically grounded military conflict. And he is closer to the evidence than Hollywood usually gets. Egyptian and Hittite records from this period, the Late Bronze Age, confirm that a Greek-speaking civilization called the Archaeology was conducting military operations in western Anatolia, exactly where Troy sits. A Hittite document even mentions a king called Alexandru of Wilusa, Wilusa being the Hittite name for what may have been Troy, and Alexandru suspiciously close to the name Alexander, the other name for Paris, the Trojan prince at the very center of the whole conflict. Is that a smoking gun? No. But when multiple independent ancient sources from different cultures, Greek, Egyptian, Hittite, all point to military activity in the same region at the same time, you are not dealing with pure invention. You are dealing with historical memory, filtered through centuries of oral tradition, shaped into myth. And that is exactly what Homer's poem appears to be. Not history, not fiction. Something in between that our modern categories do not handle particularly well. But what about the journey itself? What about Odysseus? Could a king of Ithaca, a real Greek island, have actually navigated the ancient Mediterranean for 10 years, encountering the creatures and dangers Homer describes? And here is where the archaeology gets genuinely astonishing, because some of those monsters may not have been invented at all. The Cyclops, a giant one-eyed creature living in a cave, has fascinated researchers for decades. Mediterranean islands, including Malta, Cyprus, and Crete, contain the fossilized remains of prehistoric dwarf elephants, animals that went extinct thousands of years ago. Their skulls feature a single large nasal cavity at the front that looks, to the untrained eye, exactly like a single enormous eye socket. Ancient sailors landing on these islands and finding these skulls in coastal caves would have had no framework for understanding what they were looking at. A giant, one-eyed, real enough to touch, to hold, to fear. The Sirens, dangerous creatures whose song lures sailors to their deaths on the rocks, may reflect something equally real. The Strait of Messina, between Sicily and the Italian mainland, creates bizarre oceanic and acoustic effects. Whirlpools that appear and disappear without warning. Strange sounds from currents moving between rock formations at speed. Ancient sailors crossing this strait genuinely died in unusual numbers. Homer places Scylla and Charybdis, the monster and the whirlpool, directly in this location. That is not a coincidence. That is a geographical warning embedded inside a story. And the lotus eaters, People who eat flowers that make you forget who you are and where you came from? Botanists have identified several plants from the North African coastline that produce narcotic and amnesiac effects when consumed. Ancient sailors stopping to resupply on that coast would have encountered them. The myth may be a sailor's warning passed down so many times it became a legend. What Nolan understood, and what makes his film more archaeologically interesting than most adaptations, is that Homer was not inventing a fantasy world from nothing. He was describing a real world that his ancient audience recognized, filtered through the distorting lens of oral tradition, exaggeration, and myth-making across centuries. The monsters were real enough to be remembered. The journey was real enough to be told. The war left ruins that we can still walk through today. Does this mean Odysseus definitely existed as a single historical individual? Almost certainly not. Most scholars think the character is a composite, a mythological figure assembled from the experiences of many real sailors, many real warriors, many real journeys, across a very real and very dangerous ancient Mediterranean. There was no one Odysseus, but there were thousands of men who made brutal, disorienting journeys home from wars they should not have survived. And Homer gave all of them a name, a face, and a story. Which brings us to the question that actually matters most. Why does a 3,000-year-old poem still speak to millions of people in 2026? Why does a story about a man trying to get home, facing monsters, temptation, loss, grief, loyalty, and the sheer grinding difficulty of surviving, still feel immediately, personally, uncomfortably relevant? Because the Odyssey is not really about ancient Greece. It is about what happens to a person when the world keeps getting in the way of where they need to be. It is about whether the people waiting for you are still the same people, whether you are still the same person, whether home still exists in the way you remember it, whether 10 years of violence and loss can be undone by arriving at a familiar door. Nolan's film drew from Emily Wilson's landmark 2017 translation of The Odyssey, the first English translation ever made by a woman, which rendered Homer's Greek in language that is direct, modern, and stripped of the pomposity that made earlier translations feel distant. Wilson's Odysseus is not a grand heroic type. He is exhausted, morally complicated, sometimes cruel, desperate to get home and not entirely sure what he will find when he gets there. 3,000 years, completely different world, same human problem. That is why Homer survived when empires did not. And here is something that happened this week, this actual week, in August 2026, that connects to the same spirit of discovery that drove Schliemann to dig at Hisarlik and Nolan to film at real archaeological sites across 5 countries. Archaeologists in Norway have reopened a Viking burial mound at Gronhaug on Norway's western coast that had been largely forgotten for decades. When they opened it, they found something nobody expected. Beneath the Viking grave, there is an older burial, a different culture, a different era, centuries earlier than the Vikings. Hidden underneath, we do not know who they were yet. We do not know what they believed. We do not know why that same sacred ground was chosen, by 2 entirely different civilizations separated by centuries, as the place where important people were put to rest. The ground kept their secret, and this week, archaeologists are beginning to read it. How old is the hidden burial beneath the Viking grave? Who was placed there? And what does it tell us about the people who came before the Vikings in a land we think we already know? That is our next video, Calibrated Past, where ancient evidence meets modern science.